The smell of burning pitch reaches them before they understand what is happening. The year is 1502, the 3rd day of October, somewhere in the waters off the Malabar coast of India. The ship is called the Meri, and it carries approximately 400 Muslim pilgrims returning home from their once-in-a-lifetime journey to Mecca, men who have fulfilled the sacred obligation of Hajj, women who accompanied their husbands on the holiest voyage of their faith, elderly parents being brought home by devoted children, merchants who combined pilgrimage with trade, as was common in this era of the Indian Ocean world. They have been at sea for several weeks, crossing from the port of Jeddah to the western coast of India, following trade winds that their ancestors mapped centuries before the Portuguese ever ventured beyond sight of European shores. They are perhaps 3 days from home. Some of them can already imagine the faces of children and grandchildren who will greet them at the dock. Some of them are rehearsing the stories they will tell about the holy sites they visited, the prayers they offered at the Kaaba, the spiritual transformation they experienced in the city of the Prophet. None of them understand why the Portuguese ships have surrounded them. None of them understand why the Portuguese captain, a man named Vasco da Gama, though they do not yet know his name, has ordered his men to board the Meri with weapons drawn. None of them understand why they are being herded below decks at sword point, why the hatches are being sealed above them, why they can hear the sounds of their cargo being transferred to Portuguese vessels, why the light from above is disappearing as the last opening is closed and locked. A woman named Fatima bint Abdullah is 43 years old. She has just completed the Hajj alongside her husband of 26 years, a cloth merchant from Calicut named Ibrahim. She is pressed against the wooden hull in the darkness below deck, can feel the bodies of other pilgrims crushed against her on all sides, can hear the confused shouting in Arabic and Malayalam and the grim Portuguese commands from above. She can smell the fear sweat of 400 people who do not know what is about to happen to them. She will know soon enough. The first splash of something wet hits the deck above their heads, then another. Then the unmistakable smell of pitch, the tar-like substance used to seal ship's timbers, a substance that burns with a thick, choking smoke and a heat that wood cannot resist. Then the flames. What happens over the next 4 hours in the waters off the Malabar coast is one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities in the age of European exploration, documented not by the victims, who left no survivors to tell their story, but by the Portuguese themselves, who recorded what they did with a precision that suggests they considered it not shameful but exemplary. This is the story of the Meri. This is what Vasco da Gama did to 400 Muslim pilgrims in October of 1502. This is what the Portuguese chroniclers wrote down in their own words, in their own records, in documents that have survived for over 500 years in European archives. And this is what you were never taught. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the heroic narratives that most educational systems teach about the Age of Discovery. You know Vasco da Gama as the Portuguese explorer who discovered the sea route to India in 1498, a feat of navigation that opened direct European access to the spice trade and transformed global commerce. You have seen his name on maps, in textbooks, on monuments erected to celebrate Portuguese maritime achievement. You've encountered him as a hero of exploration, a pioneer who connected continents, a figure worthy of commemoration alongside Columbus and Magellan. But you have never learned what he actually did when he reached India. You have never heard about the systematic campaign of terror he conducted against civilian populations along the Indian Ocean coast. You have never encountered the Portuguese chronicles that describe, in clinical detail, the burning of the Meri with 400 pilgrims locked inside. You have never read the accounts of what he did to the city of Calicut in the days that followed the bombardment, the mutilations, the body parts piled into boats and sent to shore as messages. Tonight you will discover what the Portuguese records themselves reveal about Vasco da Gama's second voyage to India. You will learn about the Meri and the 400 pilgrims who burned alive while Portuguese sailors watched. You will learn about the fishermen of Calicut, whose hands and ears and noses were cut off and sent to their ruler as a warning. You will learn about the bodies that da Gama hung from his ship's masts as he sailed along the coast, displaying his handiwork to every port he passed. You will learn these things not from hostile sources seeking to defame Portuguese achievement, but from the Portuguese chroniclers themselves, men who wrote down what happened because they believed their countrymen's actions were justified, because they wanted future generations to know how the Portuguese established their presence in the Indian Ocean, because they did not yet understand that history would eventually judge these events by different standards than their own. Subscribe if you want to understand what European expansion actually looked like beyond the triumphant narratives of discovery and progress. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because Fatima is standing in the darkness below deck on the Meri, and the pitch is being poured onto the timbers above her head, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened next, what the Portuguese recorded, what the victims experienced, and what this single incident reveals about the methods Europeans used to establish dominance over the Indian Ocean world. But first, I need to explain how the Meri came to be in the path of Vasco da Gama's fleet. Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India, in 1497 and 1498, was primarily exploratory, a mission to find a sea route to the spice-producing regions of Asia that would bypass the Muslim merchants who controlled overland trade routes through the Middle East. The voyage was extraordinarily difficult, with scurvy killing large portions of his crew, but it succeeded in reaching the port of Calicut on India's Malabar coast. What da Gama found there was not an empty territory waiting to be claimed, but a sophisticated trading network that had operated for centuries without European participation. Arab, Persian, Indian, Malay, and Chinese merchants had established complex systems of commerce that moved spices, textiles, precious metals, and manufactured goods across thousands of miles of ocean. The ports of the Malabar coast, Calicut, Cochin, Cananore, were prosperous nodes in this network, their wealth visible in the warehouses, marketplaces, and mansions that European visitors described with a mixture of admiration and envy. The ruler of Calicut, known as the Zamorin, received da Gama with polite curiosity but limited enthusiasm. The Portuguese had little to offer, that the Indian Ocean traders wanted European goods were inferior to Asian manufactures, and the gold and silver that might have interested merchants was in short supply on da Gama's ships. The Zamorin allowed da Gama to trade, but the terms were not favorable, and the Portuguese captain left feeling humiliated by what he perceived as insufficient respect for his mission and his monarch. Da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499 with samples of spices that demonstrated the voyage's commercial potential, but also with a grudge against the Zamorin and the Muslim merchants who dominated Indian Ocean. Trade. The Portuguese crown, recognizing both the opportunity and the obstacle, began planning a more aggressive approach. The second Portuguese voyage to India, commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral in 1500, established the pattern that da Gama would intensify. Cabral arrived with a larger fleet and clearer instructions. Establish permanent trading posts, negotiate favorable terms by force if necessary, and challenge Muslim commercial dominance. When negotiations with the Zamorin broke down, Cabral bombarded Calicut with his ship's cannons, the first European naval attack on an Indian port, killing hundreds of people and destroying significant portions of the waterfront. This was the context for Vasco da Gama's second voyage, which departed Portugal in February of 1502. Da Gama commanded a fleet of 20 ships, carrying approximately 800 men, a force explicitly designed not for exploration, but for conquest. His instructions from King Manuel I were clear. Establish Portuguese dominance over Indian Ocean trade routes by whatever means necessary, punish the Zamorin of Calicut for his perceived offenses, and demonstrate that Portuguese power would not be resisted without severe consequences. Da Gama sailed with the explicit intention of making war, and the first major target of that war would be a ship full of pilgrims who had nothing to do with the political disputes between Portugal and Calicut. The Meri was what the Portuguese called a nau, a large merchant vessel of the type that carried goods and passengers throughout the Indian Ocean. It belonged to a merchant from Calicut and had been chartered specifically to transport pilgrims to and from Mecca for the annual Hajj, the pilgrimage that every Muslim who is able is required to undertake at least once in their lifetime. The ship had departed from the Malabar coast several months earlier, carrying approximately 400 passengers to the port of Jeddah, the gateway to Mecca. The passengers were a cross-section of the Muslim communities of southwestern India, merchants and craftsmen, scholars and farmers, men and women, elderly pilgrims making their final journey, and younger ones fulfilling their religious obligation for the first time. The voyage to Mecca had been successful. The pilgrims had performed the rituals of Hajj, the circumambulation of the Kaaba, the standing at Arafat, the symbolic stoning of the devil. They had prayed in the holiest sites of their faith. They had joined millions of fellow Muslims from across the world in the annual gathering that demonstrated the unity of the Islamic community. Many had used the opportunity to trade as well, selling goods from India and purchasing items to bring home. Now they were returning, their religious duty fulfilled, their cargo holds filled with a mixture of trade goods and personal possessions, their hearts full of the spiritual experience they had just completed. The journey home typically took several weeks, following the monsoon winds that had carried ships across the Indian Ocean for centuries before any European vessel ventured into these waters. On or about the 1st of October, 1502, the Meri encountered Vasco da Gama's fleet. The Portuguese chronicles describe the encounter in language that reveals how da Gama understood the situation. The Meri was a Moorish ship, the Portuguese term for Muslim, conflating all Muslims into a single enemy category regardless of their actual origins. It was carrying rich cargo merchandise that could be seized as prizes of war. Its passengers were Moors from Mecca, pilgrims returning from Hajj, which in the Portuguese telling made them particularly devoted enemies of Christendom. Da Gama ordered his ships to intercept the Meri and prepare for boarding. The captain of the Meri, seeing the Portuguese fleet approaching with obvious hostile intent, attempted to negotiate. The chronicles record that he offered to surrender the ship's cargo, all of the trade goods, all of the merchandise, everything of commercial value in exchange for the safety of the passengers. He offered to pay ransom in any amount the Portuguese demanded. He emphasized that the passengers were pilgrims, not warriors, not combatants, not parties to any dispute between Portugal and the rulers of India. Da Gama's response, as recorded by Portuguese chroniclers who accompanied the expedition, was that he cared nothing for the cargo. What he wanted was the passengers themselves. Let me tell you who was aboard the Meri when da Gama's fleet surrounded it, because the Portuguese chronicles, while they do not provide individual names, describe the composition of the passenger group in enough detail to understand who these people were. There were approximately 400 passengers in total. The chronicles specifically note the presence of women as well as men, wives who had accompanied husbands on the pilgrimage, mothers traveling with adult children, women who had undertaken the Hajj for their own spiritual reasons. The chronicles also note the presence of what they call old men, elderly pilgrims for whom this journey represented the culmination of a lifetime of faith. The passengers included merchants of various kinds, cloth traders, spice dealers, dealers in precious metals and gems. These men combined pilgrimage with commerce, a common practice in the Indian Ocean world where trade routes and pilgrimage routes often overlapped. They carried both personal wealth and commercial goods in the ship's cargo holds. The passengers included scholars and religious figures, men who had traveled to Mecca not only to fulfill the Hajj obligation, but to study at the Islamic academies, to copy manuscripts, to deepen their understanding of their faith. Some of them carried books and documents acquired during their time in the holy cities, texts that represented irreplaceable knowledge being transported back to Indian communities. The passengers included ordinary people of modest means, farmers, craftsmen, laborers, who had saved for years to afford the pilgrimage that their faith required. For these passengers, the Hajj might represent the single greatest expenditure of their lives, an investment of savings accumulated over decades for the opportunity to fulfill their religious duty. One of these passengers was Fatima bint Abdullah, the woman I mentioned at the beginning of this account. Her name is not recorded in the Portuguese chronicles I have given it to her, because she deserves a name, because she was a real person who experienced what is about to happen, because the anonymity of victims should not be permitted to erase their humanity. Fatima was a merchant's wife from Calicut. She had accompanied her husband Ibrahim on the Hajj after their children were grown and settled. For 26 years, she had helped her husband manage his cloth business, had raised their sons and daughters, had maintained a household in one of the most prosperous ports in India. The Hajj was their gift to themselves, a journey they had planned for years, saved for carefully, anticipated with the excitement of people who were about to experience the holiest event of their lives. She had walked 7 times around the Kaaba. She had drunk from the well of Zamzam. She had stood on the plain of Arafat with 2 million other pilgrims, all of them equal before God regardless of their wealth or status. She had experienced what pilgrims describe as the most profound spiritual moment available to a Muslim, the sense of unity with the entire community of believers, living and dead, who have performed these rituals across 14 centuries. Now she was 3 days from home, standing in darkness below deck, surrounded by the smell of pitch and the first flickers of flame. The boarding of the Meri took place over approximately 2 hours on the morning of October 3rd, 1502. Portuguese soldiers boarded the ship in waves, overwhelming the minimal resistance that the passengers and crew could offer. The Meri was not a warship. It carried no cannons. Its passengers were pilgrims and merchants, not soldiers. Whatever weapons they possessed, knives, perhaps a few swords, were useless against trained Portuguese marines equipped with crossbows, arquebuses, and the steel blades that European metallurgy had made superior to anything produced in the Indian Ocean world. The chronicles describe the Portuguese systematically separating the passengers from their possessions. Cargo was removed from the holds and transferred to Portuguese ships, spices, textiles, precious metals, gems, everything of commercial value that the Meri carried. Personal possessions were stripped from the passengers themselves, jewelry, coins, documents, anything that might have value. The passengers were herded together on the main deck while this looting proceeded. The chronicles note that they pleaded for mercy in Arabic and in the Malayalam language of the Malabar coast, that they offered prayers and supplications, that they wept and embraced one another as they realized the severity of their situation. The captain of the Meri continued to negotiate. He offered everything, his ship, his cargo, his personal wealth, anything the Portuguese wanted in exchange for the lives of his passengers. The chronicles record that he specifically emphasized the presence of women and elderly passengers, appealing to whatever mercy the Portuguese might be willing to extend to non-combatants. Da Gama's response to these appeals was consistent throughout the encounter. He was not interested in cargo. He was not interested in ransom. He was interested in making a statement, a demonstration of Portuguese power that would terrify the entire Indian Ocean world into submission. The chronicles record that Da Gama personally observed the proceedings from his flagship, giving orders that were relayed to the boarding parties by subordinates. He did not board the Meri himself. He watched from a distance as his men carried out his instructions. Those instructions, as recorded by multiple Portuguese chroniclers who witnessed the events, were specific and deliberate. The passengers were to be locked below decks. The hatches were to be sealed. The ship was to be set on fire. The Portuguese chronicles describe the burning of the Meri with a clinical precision that has disturbed every historian who has analyzed these documents. The passengers were driven below decks at sword point. The main hatch, the large opening through which cargo was loaded and unloaded, was closed and secured. Smaller hatches and ventilation openings were sealed with whatever materials were available. The goal was to trap everyone below deck, to make escape impossible. Pitch was then applied to the deck and hull of the ship, the same tar-like substance used in shipbuilding to seal timbers against water, a substance that burns with intense heat and produces thick, toxic smoke. The chronicles note that substantial quantities of pitch were used, ensuring that the fire would spread rapidly and completely once ignited. The fire was set at approximately noon. What followed is described in the Portuguese chronicles with details that suggest close observation. The passengers initially attempted to break through the sealed hatches, pounding against the wood with whatever tools or improvised weapons they could find. The sounds of this pounding, desperate, rhythmic, frantic, could be heard clearly by the Portuguese sailors watching from their ships. Some passengers managed to find or create openings, weak points in the ship's structure, poorly sealed hatches, gaps that allowed escape to the deck above. The chronicles record that these escapees were met by Portuguese sailors stationed specifically to prevent any passenger from leaving the burning ship. Those who reached the deck were cut down with swords or pushed back into the flames. Those who jumped into the water were targeted by Portuguese boats circling the Meri, their crews using oars and weapons to prevent anyone from swimming to safety. The chronicles specifically note that some passengers attempted to save others, men lifting women through openings, parents pushing forward with their families, crew members trying to guide passengers to whatever exits might exist. These attempts were systematically defeated by Portuguese sailors, who had been ordered to ensure that no one survived. One chronicler, Tomé Lopes, recorded his observations of the scene. The ship burned fiercely, the flames rising high above the masts, and we could hear the screaming of those within, calling upon their prophet, which availed them nothing. Some sought to escape through the hatches, but our men cut them down as they emerged. Others leaped into the sea, but our boats were there to ensure none reached safety. The fire burned for perhaps 4 hours before the ship was consumed entirely, and by the grace of God, not one of those Moors escaped to tell what had been done to them. The phrase, "by the grace of God," appears in multiple Portuguese accounts of this event. The chroniclers understood the burning of the Meri not as an atrocity but as a religious act, the destruction of enemies of Christendom, the punishment of infidels who had dared to practice their faith in defiance of Christian dominance. Let me tell you what 4 hours of burning means for the people inside that ship. The fire began on the deck above the passengers, spreading across the pitch-soaked timbers that formed the ceiling of their prison. The heat would have been felt almost immediately, radiant energy passing through wood that grew hotter by the minute, transforming the space below from merely dark and crowded into something like an oven. The smoke came next. Burning pitch produces thick, black, toxic smoke that fills any enclosed space within minutes. The passengers would have begun choking, coughing, struggling to breathe, as the air they needed was replaced by poison. Those closest to whatever gaps remained in the ceiling would have pushed toward those gaps, fighting for the limited fresh air that might extend their survival by minutes. The heat intensified as the deck above began to burn through. Timbers that had been merely hot became sources of open flame, dripping burning pitch, and fragments of burning wood into the space below. The passengers, who could not move away from these areas, those trapped by the press of bodies, those too elderly or injured to force their way through the crowd, would have been burned directly even before the main structure caught fire. Modern fire scientists who have analyzed shipboard fires estimate that the temperature in an enclosed space below a burning deck can exceed 300 degrees within 30 minutes, hot enough to cause severe burns from mere proximity to surfaces, hot enough to make breathing itself an act of agony as superheated air sears lung tissue with every inhalation. The chronicles record that the screaming was audible for approximately 2 hours, then gradually diminished as those still alive succumbed to smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion, or the flames themselves. The ship continued to burn for another 2 hours after the screaming stopped, gradually collapsing in on itself as structural timbers gave way, eventually sinking in a hiss of steam as the waters of the Indian Ocean claimed what remained. The Portuguese fleet remained in position throughout, watching, ensuring that the destruction was complete. Da Gama is recorded as having observed the entire burning from his flagship, displaying what one chronicler described as satisfaction that justice had been done to the enemies of Christ. Fatima bint Abdullah died somewhere in that 4-hour period. She died alongside her husband Ibrahim. She died alongside the other women who had made the pilgrimage, alongside the elderly men completing their final religious duty, alongside the merchants and scholars and ordinary believers who had been returning from the holiest journey of their lives. She died 3 days from home, close enough that the coast of India would have been visible on a clear day, close enough that she might have been imagining the faces of her children when the flames reached her. The Meri carried no survivors. The Portuguese made certain of that. What makes the burning of the Meri different from many historical atrocities is that it was documented extensively by the perpetrators themselves. Multiple Portuguese chroniclers accompanied da Gama's second voyage, charged with recording the expedition's achievements for posterity. These chroniclers, Tomé Lopes, Gaspar Correa, Fernão Lopes de Castanheira, and others wrote detailed accounts of everything that happened, including the destruction of the Meri. Their accounts differ in some details, but agree on the essential facts. The ship was captured, the passengers were locked below deck, the ship was burned, everyone aboard died. These accounts were not written in shame or horror. They were written with apparent approval, presenting the burning of the Meri as a legitimate act of war against the enemies of Christendom. The chroniclers understood their task as celebrating Portuguese achievement, and they saw no contradiction between that celebratory purpose and honest description of what had occurred. Gaspar Correa's account in his Lendas da India describes the event with particular detail. The admiral ordered that the ship be set on fire with all those aboard, for he wished to make such an example that the Moors of this coast would understand what they could expect from the Portuguese. The fire was set, and though some attempted to escape, our men were positioned to ensure that none could flee the flames. The burning lasted some 4 hours, and when it was done, not one of those 400 Moors remained alive, and the ship itself had sunk beneath the waters. Correa's phrase, "to make such an example," appears repeatedly in Portuguese accounts of this period. The burning was not presented as an act of rage or a loss of control. It was presented as deliberate policy, a calculated demonstration of terror designed to intimidate an entire region into submission. Fernão Lopes de Castanheira's account adds further context. When the admiral was asked why he did not simply take the ship as a prize, he responded that he cared nothing for the cargo. He desired only to teach the Moors a lesson they would never forget, that they might know the Portuguese would show no mercy to the enemies of Christ. And so he had them burned, men, women, and all, that the smoke of their destruction might be seen from the coast, and the rulers of this land might tremble before the power of Portugal. The phrase, men, women, and all, confirms what other accounts also indicate that the passengers of the Meri included women, that da Gama knew this, and that their presence did not alter his decision to burn the ship with everyone aboard. Understanding why da Gama chose to burn the Meri, rather than simply seize its cargo, requires understanding Portuguese strategy in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese faced a fundamental problem. They were attempting to establish commercial dominance over a trading network that had operated successfully for centuries without them. They had no natural advantages in this competition. Their manufactured goods were inferior to Asian products. Their understanding of local markets was limited. Their presence was resented by established merchants who had no reason to welcome new competitors. What the Portuguese did possess was military technology that the Indian Ocean world had not yet developed defenses against. European cannons, mounted on ships specifically designed to carry them, could bombard port cities with virtual impunity. European steel weapons, forged using techniques refined through centuries of European warfare, gave individual soldiers advantages in close combat. European naval tactics, developed through generations of Mediterranean and Atlantic warfare, made Portuguese ships dangerous opponents, even when outnumbered. Da Gama's strategy was to leverage this military superiority into commercial dominance through systematic terror. The burning of the Meri was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the opening statement in a campaign designed to demonstrate that resistance to Portuguese demands would be punished with overwhelming, indiscriminate violence. The logic was explicit in Portuguese documents of the period. If the Muslim merchants who dominated Indian Ocean trade believed that the Portuguese would stop at nothing, that they would burn ships, bombard cities, massacre civilians, without regard for traditional conventions of warfare, then those merchants might choose to accommodate Portuguese demands rather than risk destruction. The Meri was selected specifically because its passengers were pilgrims returning from Mecca. Destroying them sent a message that Da Gama considered particularly valuable. The Portuguese would attack the most sacred journeys of Islam, would target the most faithful believers, would show no respect for religious obligations or non-combatant status. Nothing was protected. No one was safe. This logic of terror would define Portuguese operations in the Indian Ocean for decades. The burning of the Meri was not an aberration. It was a template that would be repeated in various forms against port cities, merchant fleets, and civilian populations throughout the region. The burning of the Meri was not an isolated incident. It was the first act in a sustained campaign of violence that Da Gama conducted against the Malabar coast over the following days. After destroying the Meri, Da Gama sailed his fleet to Calicut, the major port city ruled by the Zamorin, the same ruler who had received Da Gama without sufficient deference 4 years earlier. Da Gama had specific scores to settle with Calicut, and he intended to settle them through overwhelming violence. The bombardment began on October 20th, 1502, and continued for 3 days. The Portuguese chronicles describe the bombardment in detail. Da Gama's ships positioned themselves within cannon range of the waterfront and began systematic destruction of the port facilities. Warehouses were targeted first, the storage buildings that held the merchandise that made Calicut wealthy, the accumulated goods of dozens of merchant communities who had built their livelihoods around Indian Ocean trade. Ship by ship, building by building, the Portuguese cannons reduced these structures to rubble. The bombardment then expanded to residential areas. The chronicles note that this expansion was deliberate. Da Gama ordered his gunners to target housing, to maximize civilian casualties, to demonstrate that the Portuguese would attack not merely commercial interests, but the population itself. Tome Lopes records that the bombardment killed many Moors and Hindus, using language that suggests significant casualties without providing specific numbers. The city had no effective defense against naval bombardment. The walls that protected Calicut from land attack were useless against ships standing offshore, their cannons firing with impunity from positions that shore-based weapons could not reach. The Zamorin soldiers could do nothing but watch as Portuguese cannonballs crashed into their city, killing people who had never lifted a weapon against any European. But the bombardment was only the beginning of what Da Gama planned for Calicut. On the 3rd day of the bombardment, Da Gama ordered his men to capture as many people from Calicut as possible, fishermen working the waters near the city, traders attempting to continue commerce despite the violence, anyone who could be taken alive and brought to the Portuguese fleet. The chronicles record that approximately 38 men were captured during this operation. Some accounts give higher numbers, up to 50 or 60, but 38 is the figure most commonly cited in Portuguese sources. These captives were not prisoners in any conventional sense. Da Gama did not intend to ransom them or exchange them or hold them for negotiation. He intended to make them into messages. The Portuguese chroniclers describe what followed with their characteristic clinical precision. The captives were brought to Da Gama's flagship, where they were assembled on deck in view of the crew. Da Gama personally observed and, according to some accounts, personally supervised what happened next. Each captive was systematically mutilated. Hands were cut off at the wrist, ears were cut off at the skull, noses were cut off flush with the face. The procedures were conducted with swords and knives, without anesthesia or medical attention, on men who were fully conscious throughout. The chronicles record that not all captives survived the mutilations. Those who died from blood loss or shock during the process were simply discarded, their bodies thrown into the sea as worthless for the purpose Da Gama had in mind. Those who survived the mutilations were given additional treatment. Some accounts describe their teeth being knocked out with hammer and chisel. Some accounts describe their eyes being put out after their other features had been removed. The goal was to create figures of such comprehensive violation that their very appearance would communicate the message Da Gama wanted to send. The severed body parts, the hands, ears, and noses of 38 men were collected and piled into a small boat. The mutilated survivors were placed in the same boat, barely able to see or move or function, surrounded by the pieces of their own bodies. The boat was then sent to shore with a message for the Zamorin. The message, as recorded by Portuguese chroniclers, was brief. This is what happens to anyone who resists Portuguese demands. More will follow if cooperation is not forthcoming. Da Gama's campaign of terror continued as his fleet sailed southward along the Malabar coast. The chronicles record that captured prisoners, some from Calicut, some taken from other ports along the coast, were executed and their bodies hung from the masts of Portuguese ships. Da Gama sailed with corpses displayed prominently, ensuring that every port he passed could see what the Portuguese were willing to do. Gaspar Correa describes the scene. The admiral ordered that the bodies of Moors be hung from the yardarms and masts of his ships, that all who saw might know what fate awaited those who defied Portugal. And so we sailed along the coast, with the dead hanging above us, their bodies turning in the wind, until the smell became such that the admiral ordered them cut down and fresh bodies hung in their place. The phrase, "fresh bodies hung in their place," indicates that this was not a single display, but an ongoing practice, a continuous demonstration maintained by regularly executing new captives and displaying their corpses as the old ones decomposed beyond utility. The practice served multiple purposes in Da Gama's logic of terror. It demonstrated Portuguese willingness to kill. It showed contempt for the religious requirements of both Islam and Hinduism regarding treatment of the dead. It created a visual spectacle that would be reported from port to port, spreading fear faster than the Portuguese ships themselves could sail. Modern historians have noted that this practice, displaying enemy bodies as a form of psychological warfare, was not unique to the Portuguese. It had precedence in European warfare and would continue in colonial contexts for centuries, but the scale of Da Gama's display and its explicit purpose as a tool of commercial domination represents something distinctive: the systematic use of atrocity as business strategy. The burning of the Meri left no survivors among its passengers, but the broader campaign of Portuguese violence along the Malabar coast was witnessed by thousands of people who survived, and their accounts provide a different perspective than the Portuguese chronicles. Arab traders, who operated in the Indian Ocean, carried news of the Meri's destruction throughout the Muslim world. Within months, accounts of da Gama's atrocities had reached Cairo, Damascus, and Constantinople, the major centers of Islamic political and commercial power. These accounts emphasized what the Portuguese chronicles minimized, that the victims were pilgrims, that they were returning from the holiest journey of their faith, that their destruction was an attack on Islam itself. Indian sources, particularly those from Kerala, where the Malabar coast is located, recorded the bombardment of Calicut and the mutilation of captives in terms that emphasized the terror these events produced. A Malayalam chronicle from this period describes the Portuguese as demons from the sea, who showed no mercy to any living thing, and who committed acts that not even the worst kings of old had committed against their enemies. The Zamarin's court records, fragments of which survive in later compilations, describe the receipt of the boat carrying the mutilated captives in terms that suggest profound shock. The Zamorin is recorded as having wept when he saw what had been done to his subjects, a detail that may be literary convention, but that captures the emotional impact of da Gama's message. What the surviving accounts make clear is that da Gama's campaign achieved its immediate purpose. It produced terror. It demonstrated that the Portuguese would do things that other participants in Indian Ocean trade had never done. It established that resistance to Portuguese demands would be punished with violence that exceeded anything the region had previously experienced. Whether this terror produced the commercial results the Portuguese desired is a more complex question. In the short term, some rulers accommodated Portuguese demands rather than face Portuguese violence. In the longer term, the terror generated resistance that would eventually limit and then end Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. The very violence that established Portuguese power also guaranteed that the memory of that violence would motivate efforts to overcome it. Let me return to the passengers of the Meri and try to reconstruct who they were beyond the anonymous 400 Moors of the Portuguese chronicles. The Meri's passengers came from the Muslim communities of the Malabar coast, communities that had existed for centuries, established by Arab traders who had married into local families and created distinctive cultures that blended Islamic and Indian elements. These communities, known as Mapalas, were integral to the commercial prosperity of the region, their trading networks extending from East Africa to Southeast Asia. The passengers would have included members of established merchant families, men whose ancestors had been trading across the Indian Ocean for generations, whose commercial relationships connected dozens of ports, whose knowledge of markets and routes and conditions was irreplaceable. These merchants represented accumulated expertise that their communities would need decades to rebuild after their loss. The passengers would have included religious scholars, men trained in Islamic law and theology, teachers and judges who served their communities' spiritual and legal needs. The Islamic academies of the Malabar coast were renowned throughout the Indian Ocean world, and many scholars made the Hajj not only as personal obligation, but as professional development, to study with teachers in Mecca and Medina, whose knowledge they would bring back to their students. The passengers would have included craftsmen and professionals, men who had saved for years to afford the Hajj, who had left businesses and trades in the care of relatives during their absence, who were returning to resume lives that they expected would continue for decades more. And the passengers included women. The Portuguese chronicles specifically note the presence of women among the victims, though they provide no details about who these women were or why they were traveling. Women made the Hajj for the same reasons men did, because their faith required it, because they sought the spiritual benefits of pilgrimage, because they wanted to walk where the Prophet had walked and pray where generations of believers had prayed. Some traveled with husbands, some with other family members, some in groups organized specifically for women pilgrims. They faced additional challenges that male pilgrims did not restrictions on travel, without male guardians, different requirements for ritual clothing, practical difficulties of menstruation and pregnancy during a journey that might last months, but they made the journey nonetheless. The women of the Meri died alongside the men. They burned in the same fire, choked on the same smoke, were prevented from escape by the same Portuguese sailors stationed to ensure complete destruction. Their deaths were not separate from the men's deaths. They were part of the same deliberate massacre. Vasco da Gama's second voyage established patterns of Portuguese behavior in the Indian Ocean that would continue for decades. The Portuguese built a network of fortified trading posts, Goa, which they conquered in 1510, became their regional capital, and used naval power to attempt to control all trade in the region. Ships that refused to carry Portuguese passes could be attacked, their cargo seized, their crews killed or enslaved. The maritime freedom that had characterized the Indian Ocean for centuries was replaced, at least in Portuguese-controlled waters, with a system of permits and extortion backed by the threat of violence. The memory of the Meri persisted in the Indian Ocean world as a symbol of Portuguese brutality. Arabic accounts of the Portuguese period frequently reference the destruction of pilgrim ships, using the Meri and similar incidents to argue that Portuguese presence represented not legitimate commerce but piracy, sanctioned by a European monarch. These accounts shaped Muslim resistance to Portuguese expansion for generations. The Portuguese themselves eventually recognized that unlimited violence was counterproductive. Later, governors and administrators attempted to moderate the terror campaigns that da Gama had initiated, recognizing that commercial prosperity required at least minimal cooperation from local populations. But the damage had been done. Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean was permanently associated with the atrocities of the early years, creating antagonisms that would never fully heal. The broader pattern that the Meri represents, European willingness to commit mass atrocities in pursuit of commercial advantage, would repeat throughout the colonial period. What the Portuguese did in the Indian Ocean, the Spanish did in the Americas, the Dutch did in Indonesia, the British did in India and Africa and elsewhere. The burning of the Meri was not an aberration. It was a template. The burning of the Meri is one of the best documented atrocities of the early colonial period because the Portuguese documented it themselves. The original chronicles Tomé Lopes' account. Gaspar Correa's Lendas da India, Fernão Lopes de Castañeda's Historia do Descobrimento e Conquista da India pelos Portugueses survive in manuscript and printed form in archives throughout Europe, and have been edited and published by modern scholars. These texts provide the primary source material for understanding what happened. Additional Portuguese sources, official correspondence, administrative records, later histories that drew on now-lost materials provide supplementary detail and alternative perspectives on the events. The Portuguese crown maintained extensive records of its overseas operations, and while many of these records have been lost, enough survives to reconstruct the broad outlines of policy and practice. Non-Portuguese sources provide important alternative perspectives. Arab chronicles, Indian histories, and accounts from other European visitors to the Indian Ocean in subsequent decades describe Portuguese behavior in terms that both confirm the Portuguese accounts and add details the Portuguese chroniclers minimized or omitted. Archaeological evidence is limited but suggestive. The precise location where the Meri was burned has never been identified, and the ship itself, wooden construction that would have been entirely consumed by fire and then dispersed by ocean currents, left no physical trace that has been discovered. But excavations at sites like Calicut have uncovered evidence of the bombardment that da Gama conducted, including cannonballs and destruction layers that can be dated to this period. The weight of evidence makes the burning of the Meri one of the most certain atrocities of the early colonial period. It is not rumor or legend, or hostile propaganda. It is documented fact, recorded by the perpetrators themselves, corroborated by independent sources, consistent with the broader pattern of Portuguese behavior in the Indian Ocean during this period. For centuries, the burning of the Meri was either celebrated or ignored in European historiography. Portuguese national histories treated da Gama as a hero of discovery and empire, minimizing or omitting the atrocities he committed. School textbooks presented the Age of Discovery as a triumph of European exploration and progress, with little attention to the violence that accompanied Portuguese expansion. Da Gama was commemorated in monuments, honored in place names, celebrated in national memory as one of Portugal's greatest historical figures. When the atrocities were mentioned, they were typically justified. The victims were Moors, enemies of Christendom, whose destruction was legitimate within the framework of religious warfare that Europeans applied to their conflicts with Muslim powers. The violence was necessary, the only way to establish European presence in regions that resisted European demands. The terror was proportionate, a rational response to the challenges of operating thousands of miles from home in hostile waters. This interpretation dominated for approximately 400 years. It was only in the late 20th century that historians began systematically re-evaluating the Age of Discovery, and recognizing that events like the burning of the Meri represented not heroic achievement, but criminal violence. The shift in interpretation reflected broader changes in historical consciousness, the decolonization of former European empires, the recognition of non-European perspectives as legitimate historical sources, the development of human rights frameworks that made atrocities recognizable as atrocities, regardless of when they occurred or who committed them. Today, most academic historians recognize the burning of the Meri as a massacre, the deliberate killing of hundreds of civilians for purposes of political terror. The Portuguese chronicles are read not as celebrations of achievement, but as documents of crime, valuable precisely because they record in the perpetrator's own words what was done. But this academic consensus has not yet fully reached popular understanding. Vasco da Gama remains a heroic figure in Portuguese national memory and in many educational curricula worldwide. The Meri and its 400 passengers remain largely unknown to general audiences. The atrocity remains, in a meaningful sense, hidden in plain sight, documented in sources that scholars have long known about, but that popular education continues to ignore. Modern scholars who study mass atrocities recognize patterns in the burning of the Meri that recur in other contexts. The dehumanization of victims reducing individuals to categorical enemies, Moors or infidels, whose individual humanity was irrelevant to decisions about their fate, is a consistent feature of mass violence across history and culture. The Portuguese did not see Fatima bint Abdullah as a woman returning home from a religious pilgrimage. They saw a Moor, a member of an enemy category, whose destruction served Portuguese purposes. The use of atrocity as strategic communication, killing civilians, not for any direct military purpose, but to send messages to other audiences, is a logic that persists in terrorism and state violence today. Da Gama burned the Meri not because its passengers threatened him, but because their destruction would terrify others into compliance. The documentation of atrocity by perpetrators recording acts that later generations would recognize as crimes reflects the ways that moral frameworks shift over time. The Portuguese chroniclers did not expect their descendants to read their accounts with horror. They expected celebration of Portuguese power and Christian triumph. The gap between their expectations and our reception measures the distance moral understanding has traveled in 5 centuries. The forgetting and then remembering of atrocity, the process by which events are suppressed, ignored, or celebrated in one era, and then rediscovered and reinterpreted in another, is itself a phenomenon that scholars have studied. The Meri was not secret. It was simply inconvenient. a story that did not fit the narratives that European powers wanted to tell about themselves. Its current visibility reflects not new evidence, but new willingness to see evidence that was always available. For Fatima bint Abdullah, who was 43 years old, who had just completed the holiest journey of her faith, who was 3 days from home when the Portuguese surrounded her ship, who died in fire and smoke in the waters off the Malabar coast while her killers watched. For Ibrahim, her husband, who was a cloth merchant from Calicut, who had built a business and raised a family and saved for years to make the pilgrimage, who died alongside his wife in a ship they should never have been aboard if the Portuguese had not been waiting for them. For the captain of the Meri, whose name the chronicles do not record, who offered everything, his ship, his cargo, his own life in exchange for his passengers' safety, who negotiated and pleaded and prayed while the Portuguese prepared their fire, who died knowing that he had failed to save the people entrusted to his care. For the elderly pilgrims who had waited a lifetime for the Hajj, who had finally fulfilled the obligation that their faith placed upon them, who died returning from the journey they had dreamed of for decades. For the scholars who carried manuscripts and knowledge across the ocean, whose learning would have enriched their communities for generations, whose books and wisdom burned with them in a fire that destroyed centuries of accumulated understanding. For the merchants whose commercial networks connected dozens of ports, whose relationships and expertise represented irreplaceable knowledge, whose deaths disrupted trade patterns that had sustained communities throughout the Indian Ocean world. For the women who traveled with their husbands or their families, or in groups of fellow pilgrims, who faced the same fire as the men, who burned and choked and died in the same darkness, whose presence the Portuguese noted but did not allow to alter their plans. For the approximately 400 people whose names we do not know, whose individual stories we cannot recover, whose deaths were documented only as a collective massacre by chroniclers, who saw them not as people, but as enemies destroyed. For the fishermen and traders of Calicut, whose hands and ears and noses were cut off to send a message to their ruler, who survived their mutilation only to live as walking reminders of what the Portuguese were willing to do. For the residents of Calicut who died in the bombardment, killed by cannon fire as they went about their daily lives, guilty of nothing except living in a city whose ruler had offended Portuguese pride. For the unnamed captives whose bodies hung from Portuguese masts as the fleet sailed along the coast, displayed as trophies of terror, denied the burial rites that their religions required. For everyone who died in Vasco da Gama's second voyage, a voyage that the Portuguese celebrated as achievement and that history has gradually recognized as sustained atrocity. They were not enemies. They were pilgrims, fishermen, merchants, residents of cities that had welcomed trade from across the known world. They became enemies only in the Portuguese imagination, classified as Moors, and therefore legitimate targets for any violence that Portuguese strategy required. They did not threaten Portugal. The 400 passengers of the Meri had no interest in European affairs, no involvement in the diplomatic disputes between the Zamorin and the Portuguese crown, no capacity to harm da Gama or his fleet in any way. They were killed not for what they had done, but for what they represented, a Muslim presence in the Indian Ocean that the Portuguese were determined to destroy or dominate. They did not receive mercy. The women aboard the Meri did not protect the ship from destruction. The elderly pilgrims did not earn clemency through their age or their religious devotion. The offers of ransom and surrender did not persuade da Gama to spare lives he could easily have preserved. The Portuguese chronicles make clear that mercy was never considered, that the entire purpose of the operation was to kill everyone aboard as visibly and terrifyingly as possible. They deserved better. They deserved to complete their journey home. They deserved to tell their families about the pilgrimage they had made. They deserved to live out their lives in peace, to die of natural causes at natural times, to be mourned by people who loved them rather than killed by strangers who did not know their names. This is what Vasco da Gama did to 400 Muslim pilgrims, on a single ship in October of 1502. This is what the Portuguese chroniclers recorded in their own words, in their own documents, in archives that have been accessible to scholars for centuries. This is what the Age of Discovery actually looked like for the people who were discovered not opportunity and progress, but fire and smoke and death at the hands of Europeans who saw them not as humans but as obstacles to commercial dominance. The Meri burned for 4 hours in the waters off the Malabar coast. The screaming lasted for 2 hours before it stopped. The Portuguese watched until the ship sank, ensuring that no one survived. And then they sailed on to Calicut to continue the campaign of terror that the burning of the Meri had begun. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know about the Age of Discovery but has only heard the European version. The heroes of exploration committed atrocities. The voyages of discovery were voyages of conquest. The 400 passengers of the Meri died so that Portugal could control the spice trade. Remember them. Remember what was done to them. Remember